Hello, chapter 22. We're doing it, guys. You're doing great. So the Civil War, we talked about all the battles last chapter and the strengths and weaknesses of both sides, and then kind of how it ended. So now is, I was going to say arguably harder, but I can't say it'd be harder than the Civil War. But in a lot of ways, it's very, very difficult. Is the aftermath, right? So what are they dealing with? Just looking at the picture, like the bottom left, a lot of the cities in the South are totally destroyed. Um, Agriculture is largely destroyed. Their workers, right? They've lost basically their workforce in a lot of ways in the South. And then just think about kind of once the South comes back to the Union, right? How do you move forward? The South doesn't want to be back, right? They're forced to be back. They definitely don't want to be. Um, and how do you bring them back into the government? Do you just let them come back into Congress? Are there certain stipulations? What about like all the debt that occurred because of the war? Who should pay that? Um, anyway, there's a lot of these issues having to be worked out. Okay, here's another one. How do we make sure that the South actually emancipated, right? How do we make sure that happens, and what's the government's role in that? So there's a whole lot to deal with, and it's definitely not easy without Lincoln. So let's get into it. This is actually going to be one of those dates that you're going to have to know. We're going to talk about it more next chapter, but basically, this whole time period after the Civil War, this rebuilding, is from 1865, the end of the war, to 1877. So that's the time period. You might be asked, like, when did Reconstruction end? 1877, and we'll talk exactly why in the next chapter. But just so you know. Okay, let's do it. So I kind of already mentioned this just now, but after the war, the cities are destroyed. A lot of these major cities that were economic hubs, right, are destroyed. Transportation's destroyed. So even though, like, let me click. Even though they're trying to get back on their feet again, like they have to rebuild their transportation. Remember the railroad lines with Sherman, and um, businesses were closed, factories were closed, agriculture is crippled. And I mentioned this as well. Their moral stance is, I don't want to come back. You're making me come back, but I'm not come here because I want to. That's not going to be a great mindset for the Union to come back together. So, kind of, what do you do? Where do you start? Well, we know the 13th Amendment and the Emancipation Proclamation before that, right, happened in the war. And so after the war, they're going to pass the 13th Amendment. So really, slavery is going to be abolished, even in border states. But how do they take the next step? How do these freedmen, take the next step in their lives? It's going to be very, very hard. And really, we're going to be talking about the after effects of slavery, the after effects of racism for a long, long, long time to come. And you know what? It's still around some places. Okay, so really it's going to differ though upon different states. Like for example, Mississippi is going to be one of the hardest ones for the Union to really help emancipate, and you'll see kind of keep them on their feet. It's going to differ based on master too, or owner. Some actually will stay with their owners because they had a good relationship. But really, it's more so, why would they stay? It's what else can they do, right? They have not been educated. They do not have money. They do not have land. They don't have many other choices. But one huge strength that's going to happen is the communities for blacks are really going to gather and become powerful for each other, both politically eventually, but definitely, emotionally and socially. There were a huge group that left the South, like some of the southern states, like Louisiana and Texas, and they just wanted to get out. So have you heard the book of the Bible, Exodus? What's Exodus about? Right? It's about Moses, taking their people out of slavery, out of Egypt. And so this was kind of definitely a reference to that, of getting their people out and leaving to go to Kansas, out of the deep South. Eventually, they were actually stopped. The whites there in Kansas thought there was too many, but that was a group that had gone. But a huge focal point for these Black communities are going to be the church. The church is really going to be the central point, definitely spiritually, but also socially, and helping each other out. And it's going to be almost a gathering point too for some of the political movements that they're trying to change. Even today, the Black church is a huge cultural and social center point for a lot of people. Two specific church denominations that really rose big were the Baptist Church and the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Now, what is the government's role in helping these freedmen? Right? The Union freed them, but a lot of them are really going to be oppressed still, both in forceful ways. We'll talk about the KKK in a little bit, but also in indirect ways. So the government, they're going to pass this bureau called the Freedmen's Bureau. And it's essentially kind of like a welfare agency. We have those today. You know what welfare is? People that are on welfare, what they get. So it can be anything from helping them with clothes, helping with meals, health, all those kind of basic needs. But what they become actually best known for, the change that they're best known for, is what would they want to focus on in order to help these freedmen rise from their situation. Some people might say land or money, which they weren't great at that. But actually education, helping them read, helping them write, and, getting that knowledge and that education level so they can, hopefully move up. Okay, well, speaking of the Freedmen's Bureau, now we have Andrew Johnson as president, and just so you know, he does veto the Freedmen's Bureau a couple times. So let's talk about him. He's a very interesting character. At a young age, his dad died, I think, saving someone in a river. His mom basically had him become an apprentice. If you know what an apprentice is, it's basically these almost like internships, not paid, where young kids are essentially kind of sent off to work with these people that can teach them a trade. Here he was working with a tailor. Eventually he does become his own tailor. But eventually he moved to Tennessee, can't read and write, so his wife actually teaches him how to do that. He's got one of the hardest upbringings as a president, history since, even more so than Lincoln. People sometimes compare him to Andrew Jackson a little bit, kind of similar storylines. But he eventually becomes mayor, governor, and then senator for Tennessee. Well, what's interesting is that when he is senator, Tennessee secedes, but he personally says, I am not seceding. I meant to say something else. So that's a very, very interesting role, right? A lot of people harassed him and his family in Tennessee and burned him in effigy. And so he's not really liked in the South. Now, I'm going to rewind real quick because something that's important about him. Because he had this rough upbringing, he actually despised the kind of aristocratic planter society in the South. Just kind of the, you know, I don't like them stereotypes. But what's interesting is he actually did have slaves too. So it wasn't like a moral, I'm better than them. It was a, I don't like that they're rich and have power. Um, so, okay, let's go back to this. He isn't liked by the South and isn't going to be loved by the North, but Lincoln is going to bring him on. And first, he's going to be a war governor. He's appointed the governor of Tennessee during war. But then in Lincoln's second election, he is going to be asked to run on Lincoln's ticket. Why? Because he's going to be a war Democrat, right? So a Democrat that supports the war. And so that's a big symbol of that Union Party when you have Lincoln as a Republican coming together with a war Democrat. I don't think they truly foresaw him becoming president, but more as a kind of a vote getter here. He's a very principled man, and you'll see that kind of come up. But it's just an interesting. He's not really northern. He's not really southern. Like nobody really loves him. And so it's not going to be a great fit for these very difficult times, and we'll get into that. Okay, so what do we do with the South, right? How do we bring them back into the Union? Okay, so there's 4 plans. I'm going to talk about 3, and then in a second I'll talk about the 4th one. The 4th one needs some more developing before we get there. Okay, well, before the war was even over, Lincoln is going to have this idea of the 10% Reconstruction Plan. And, we've talked about Lincoln being pretty charitable to the South. Well, in his idea, he's basically saying, like, let's just get them back into the Union officially, and then we can work out all the details. And so what this means is in order to become back in the Union, a state, 10% of the people in that state that had voted in that 1860, the Lincoln election before the Civil War, 10% had to give an oath of allegiance to the Union and admit, and the whole state had to, adhere to emancipation, the Emancipation Plan and abolition. 10%, what do you think about that? It's pretty tiny, right? You only need 10% of a state that rebelled and went to war you only want 10% to give their oath of allegiance. Isn't that crazy? I mean, just thinking about that I don't know, maybe that's small-minded, but that is, a lot of people, especially in Congress, were not okay with this. So it never got passed, but that was his idea. So then Congress, the Republicans, are going to say, okay, let's do the Wade Davis bill. All right, and in this, it was 50%. So taking that back up to a lot higher of a allegiance level. They're like, no, they have to pay for it more than just 10%. Well, I don't know if you've heard of a pocket veto. You'll learn about this in government. But basically, pocket veto is Congress can kind of work to the end. They have a kind of ending point for their session. They get all this bill passed through the House and the Senate, and then the president has to sign it, right? Well, Lincoln's actually going to pocket veto it, which means that he's not vetoing it out loud. He's just not signing it. And they go into, they're done with their session, and so it never gets passed. So that's how he feels about it. And then Lincoln, obviously, his assassination, now you're left with Johnson. So Johnson has some interesting thoughts here. He's going to he's going to be 10% as well. He is going to go with Lincoln, with some other things behind it. The states have to repeal their secession, basically saying, okay, we're not seceding anymore. It's deny their Confederate debt, meaning like, look, the Union doesn't have to pay for your debt. And then they have to ratify the 13th Amendment officially. So it is pretty similar to Lincoln there. What was I going to tell you? one interesting thing is a lot of people were frustrated in Congress that these old Confederates who had just rebelled, these leaders could come back and be in power again in the government, in Congress. Well, it was interesting. Johnson, in a lot of ways, said, okay, you can't have your land back, or you can't come back into Congress unless you personally come apologize to me. Isn't that so interesting? So what is that? Why did he do that? That is a power move, right? That is petty, basically saying like, come beg in person. Because remember, he didn't like that aristocratic class. So ultimately, the 13th Amendment gets passed, and pretty quickly, these states are going to do this because 10% is not that hard. Now, do they enjoy the 13th Amendment? No. But they realize it's kind of, this is what they think. We can get back in really quickly, restore our governments, put our people back in charge, and then we can do what we want to with these former slaves, and we can keep them down. So let's talk about ways that they did keep them down. So what black codes, we've heard the term codes before. Codes mean, anybody? Laws, right? We've talked about slave codes, or I don't know if you remember Mesopotamia, Hammurabi's code. So here, instead of slave codes, it's now just black codes. And it's essentially just ways to keep these former slaves down. Yes, they're free, but no, they don't have power. Mississippi was the worst. And it's going to be a huge struggle even when you get to the civil rights movement down in Mississippi. But here's some examples of some of the codes here. They were kind of, where do I start here? They were forced in a lot of ways to work for their former owners or their former masters, because they didn't have money to move or to buy their own land, or so a lot of times they would now work for them, getting money or sharecropping. We'll talk about that. But really, they're not getting much at all, and so they're keeping them under contract, almost like indentured servants, right? In some ways. So there would be penalties if you wanted to switch and go work for somebody else, and they would basically drag them back like a fugitive slave, essentially. They didn't give them rights, like obviously voting, that you couldn't serve on a jury, even if it was a freedman's trial. There could be no blacks on the jury. How crazy is that, right? We'll talk more too about some other ways. And so I just mentioned this sharecropping became really the new economic system in the South. They would still have some of these large plantations, but now you have these people in this picture work for them. But either two options. One is for very, very low wages, or sharecropping is, it could happen, the owner would either give out seeds, and those people would grow on their land, and they would get a share of whatever they grew, but the rest would go to the landowner. But really, this is just a way to keep them down and oppressed. And I wanted you to see in this picture, this is going to be poor whites as well. This is not just these freedmen, but a lot of poor whites. This is kind of the New South in a way. All right. So we mentioned there were 4 Reconstruction plans, right? Well, Congress is not going to enjoy Andrew Johnson. And they are really the theme of Johnson's, most of his presidency is fighting with Congress. And this is a Republican Congress. I mean, this is who Lincoln's party, essentially. Okay, let's go. So during the Civil War, Republicans had power, obviously, because the South had seceded. And they passed, I'm going to put these 3 things up here. They passed a lot of acts, things that they wanted to get done without the South, essentially. So we've already talked about 2 of them. The Morrill tariff, do you remember what that did? What kind of tariff was that? It raised tariffs so it would help who? Northern manufacturers. I'm going to skip real quick. The Homestead Act we talked about. how people could move out west, right? And they would get land for pretty cheap. And the idea was move out these people that support the Union and get more states and people out there. And then the Pacific Railroad Act. So this is going to be the first transcontinental railroad. Remember we talked in a different chapter about the argument, where should the railroad go, right? Should it go in the north, or remember the Gadsden Purchase, the famous Gadsden Purchase, or should it go within the South? And that became this argument until the Civil War. Now they don't have to get the South to approve this. So where is it going to be? It's going to be in the north. It's going to be a transcontinental. And we'll talk more about this one later in a different chapter too. But that's a big deal. So all these Republicans were used in the war, used to getting their way. And now what's going to happen is Johnson's going to come, and they don't like Johnson's ideas. And then the second thing is you're going to have all these Confederates, right, rejoining. These Confederates that are going to come back are going to be called whitewashed rebels. You know what the term whitewash means? You ever heard that? With like, let's say you have a dirty fence. Dirty. So it's a white fence got dirty. What could you do? You could clean it off, right? Or just paint on over it. No one will notice, right? So although it looks nice on the outside, underneath it still got the dirt and the grime. So that's the term they gave to these rebels is, oh, they look all good on the outside. They're coming back to the Union, but really they're still, kind of dirty underneath. Well, this is something gets tricky here, okay? And the Congress, the Republican Congress, sees kind of the writing on the wall here. All right, so if slaves are emancipated, they are no longer 3/5, right? They don't count for that 3/5 population count for Congress. And remember how they counted that for congressional representation in the House? But they can't vote. So they're going to count more for the South, so the South can have more representation in the House, right? Even though that representation comes from people who don't like the South's policies. Does that make sense? So the North is going to get pretty worried here. In 1865, Johnson has completely restored the South back to the Union, and now Republicans think they have to act pretty quickly here. And so here begins the beginning of Johnson versus Congress in a lot of ways. So we talked about him. He's going to start vetoing a lot. Johnson's going to veto a lot of things that Congress wants passed. So the Freedmen's Bureau is going to get vetoed. And so Congress is going to have an idea here, this Republican Congress, of what they can do. They're going to pass a civil rights bill. And in this bill, they're essentially, I don't want to draw something. Okay, I'm going to pause this for a second. Okay, I want you to kind of keep track of this so you don't get all confused with some of these bills that I talk about. But basically, there's going to be 3 amendments. They're going to be called the Reconstruction Amendments. 13th, the 14th, and the 15th. And so when you have to try to think about what amendments you need to know just overall in this class, it's going to be the first 10, the Bill of Rights, and then it's going to be these 3, the Reconstruction Amendments. And then later we'll talk about women's suffrage, and prohibition. But for right now, the 13th, the 14th, and 15th. And every time there is an amendment, it's going to start as some kind of act or bill or something ahead of time. So Emancipation Proclamation, right, in 1863, eventually is going to become the 13th Amendment in 1865. I think actually the amendments are back-to-back years too. But it becomes now in the Constitution. And the thing here is, why Congress wants to make these amendments is bills and acts and these kind of things, they can be canceled by the next president. Whoever comes in or the next Congress, they can get rid of it. But an amendment, those are really hard to change once they're in the Constitution and have been voted on. So, what they're going to do is they're going to come up with this idea called the Civil Rights Bill. And basically, in it, sorry, they are trying to get, let's see if I can put this in here somewhere. Oh, where do I want to put it? Okay. They basically want freedmen to become citizens. Ideally, they think, you know what, we want them to be kind of like women, where they count as citizens, but they don't have to vote. But and they're worried though that the next Congress or the next president will get rid of this, or even Johnson. So they're going to put this into an amendment. So if this is 13th, right, is abolition. This is, there's a couple of things in it, but the main, here, let me show you. The main core takeaway is freedmen now have citizenship. All right. Just here are the other interesting things in it. They also reduced the representation of Confederates in Congress if they did not approve this 14th Amendment. They disqualified former Confederates. They guaranteed the national debt. And anyway, the South is not going to like this. Johnson doesn't like this, but it gets passed anyway. They go over they go over Johnson's head. They're going to go around his veto many, many times. So Johnson starts to get mad. And I don't know if you know much about like elections, but between presidential elections every 4 years, every 2 years, you have midterm elections. They're really big. I think voting in general goes down for midterm elections, but the power of midterms are huge because if, let's say, a president loses the Senate or loses Congress for their party, now they can't pass anything. They can't get these things that they want to get passed because they don't have, Republicans in power or Democrats, whatever, in their party. So Johnson's like, okay, midterm elections are coming up. I need to go basically campaign. And so it goes, they call it round the circle. But Johnson is pretty hot-headed, and he gets into these fights essentially on the tour. And it turns out that he loses a lot of votes, and now it's going to become pretty strongly Republican in Congress. So now really Congress can do anything they want to do, even if it's over his head. Now you have different groups of Republicans here in Congress. You're going to have moderates and you're going to have radicals. Moderates are what they sound like, moderate, right? Radical, though, let's talk about radical Republicans. Radical Republicans essentially, even during the war, they wanted immediate emancipation. They wanted, let's do what we have to do to end this war, right? Where we win. There's no peace talk. Where the moderates are a little bit more like, okay, let's think at least about the South in some ways. Thankfully, the moderates are going to win out, but we'll come back to this idea in a little bit. Okay, so the Republicans come up with this is the fourth Reconstruction Plan. So let's just go through them again. Lincoln's 10%. Wade Davis was 50%. And then you have Johnson's 10%, right? Well, now that Congress is in charge, essentially, they're going to come up with their own, right? And it's got a couple of different parts to it. But one of the big ones was there are going to be 5 military districts. And in the South, they're literally going to divide up the South into 5 areas and put their troops there. Why are they putting troops there? To enforce a lot of this Black rights, and we're going to talk about a new one here in a second. Let me go ahead and put this here. Where's my little document? Okay. So now we're going down to our All right, any guesses? What's other than the military districts here? What's going to be the other? So this is going to be okay. Um, um, so in this act, they're going to divide it up. And here's a big part here is in these constitutions that states have, they have to have full suffrage for freedmen. But even though they put it in an act, what do we know about acts? Is the next president or whatever can come and veto it or get it out. I mean, and so they make it, they move, and really look, it's 3 years. It takes a long time to get an amendment passed here. So it's not just like, what do we want to do? Let's do it right away. But they finally do get the 15th Amendment passed. Now, cartoon. They remember we talked about it's a military district, so they are bringing their soldiers down here to help with these elections. Because is the South, are they really going to run these elections and allow their freedmen to vote? Like, no, they're not going to do that. So that's part of the big reason of the military districts is to enforce this. And now I want you to look. So if you've got these, I'm going to skip Ex Parte Milligan. I don't think that's important. I need to take that out. Think about everything else that we have. So if that was what they required, right? They required state constitutions to add suffrage, and it finally, they were completely. If you look the different years that this happens, when did they get readmitted, right? And it's pretty quickly for some of them. I mean, quickly is, I guess, the right word. And then look who's all last here. Look at Georgia, but it is if you think of Deep South, look at this bottom here, right? That's essentially what it is. Oh, why did I say it's last? What is this order? It's not last. Look, 1877. You got Florida and Louisiana and South Carolina, Mississippi, Texas. I guess it's organized here by the state. Interesting. And once they have officially marked all the boxes in their state constitutions, they are considered home rule, meaning if you read this, home rule, which means democratic or redeemer regime. What that means is now they can be back in charge of their own state governments again. So Democrats can come back in charge of their own southern states now. Yeah. Okay. I want to add one thing here. There was one group that was very upset when this 15th Amendment got passed. No, not Southerners. Maybe I should say more than one group. Another group in the North that got very upset that this was passed. Any ideas? Women. Women who have been fighting since Seneca Falls, right, for their own self-suffrage. They were not included in this amendment. It did not include gender here. It was just freed men, black men in this. Or race was included, but not gender. So that was a pretty frustrating thing for a lot of women. Okay. So now now that they have, been redeemed and now you have the 15th Amendment and they can vote, what does that look like? There's going to be the Union League is kind of like a, organization that at first is going to have, some how do we help black people, but also it's going to be getting people power and voting and how do we encourage people to vote and who should they vote for, and so that was the Union League. So there are going to be some black delegates. It's going to take a while in some places, but they're going to be mayors. There's 2 senators, a deputy governors, and but it's not going to be like an overwhelming thing at all. But that's a victory, a small victory. But that's definitely a victory. Now, a lot of people in the South do not like the people from the North who have helped them, or people in the South. So they're going to have these like terms that they call people, bad terms. What's the word? Whatever. Scallywags and carpetbaggers. Oh, you're such a scallywag. A scallywag was someone who was in the South, who lived in the South and supported the Union cause and supported all these movements here. Gosh, you're such a scallywag because you supported the Union. Or the other term, carpetbaggers. That's a picture of a carpetbagger right there on the left. Carpetbaggers were people who came from the North and brought their carpet bags, like their luggage, right? Brought them down to the South so they could fill it with money, so they could take advantage of the South while they're rebuilding. So it was these Northerners that were taking advantage of the South. That was a carpetbagger. Now, although the vote is now starting to come, right, for a lot of these freedmen, there's still a lot of corruption. Okay, how can we buy their votes? How can we, right? There's still a lot of needed reforms. Some reforms do get passed, but we'll talk about some. But one of the biggest hindrances to the new black suffrage is going to be the KKK. I know you've heard of them before, also known as the Invisible Empire of the South. Basically, their job was to scare blacks into not voting, or not really engaging in any of their rights. It was also used to scare white people who helped support these freed blacks. And they dressed up anonymously with these white capes and essentially just threatened and terrorized these people. I mean, this was at night. They would come on horseback at night wearing these, they're anonymous. We talk about that in psychology. When you're anonymous, you're much more likely to do bad things. What was I saying? Like burning crosses and really, really scary tactics to get blacks not to vote. Eventually, the government's going to pass force acts, which basically make things like this and intimidation like this illegal. But it's still going to happen. There's still going to be lynchings and burnings and bodies hanging for getting too comfortable in their new roles, or getting to, voting and doing things that these former Confederates did not like. Some other ways that they kept freedmen down were literacy tests. So this was a law that they would put into their local either constitutions, or that if you can't read, you can't vote. Now, that being said, a lot of these backcountry or whoever whites, a lot of them couldn't read either, and so very unfair tests. And then we'll talk about more in the next chapter too. But so really, really difficult time. If we think about politically, socially, emotionally, all this stuff. This after the Civil War was really, really difficult. And I mentioned before, Lincoln gets romanticized, and he did so much, and he had such the perfect countenance to be able to win that war and decision making, or else Reconstruction wouldn't have even happened. But a lot of historians say if he stayed around if he didn't get killed, his reputation would not be as shiny as we think it is today because of all the difficulty. So, Congress could have been mad at him too. Okay, so Congress did not like Johnson, right? We know that. He vetoed them, they went around him. He's not a Northerner, not a Southerner. Well, they basically passed this act called the Tenure of Office Act. And what it said is if you, even today, a new president wants to get somebody in their cabinet, Congress has to approve it. Well, this basically said, like, they couldn't fire someone without Congress approving it. That's not a thing. largely through this. Um, and I don't know if you know, modern day people, cabinet members either step down or asked to leave. That happens quite a bit. So here Johnson asks, I think it's Secretary of, I can't think, but it's Stanton, to step down because Stanton, they just didn't get along, and the Congress knew that, and that's why they passed this. So he asked him to leave, or he made him resign without congressional approval, and boom, here comes impeachment because of that act. And now that being said, I want to say something very important. Impeachment does not mean, if a president gets impeached, it does not mean that they're out of office. Okay, this happened with Trump. Trump got impeached, but did he stay in office? Well, that was different. Okay, Clinton. Clinton got impeached. He went through the impeachment process, but he was not found guilty, and he stayed in. The same thing is going to happen to Andrew Johnson. Actually, no president has been found guilty and had to leave because of impeachment. Now, there's someone that probably would have. Nixon resigned before the impeachment trial. So he saw the writing on the wall. He didn't want to go through the whole process. But, so just one last thing. Just because you're impeached doesn't mean you leave office. Impeachment is just the process here of Congress looking into some impeachable offense. Well, long story short, it was this big, huge deal. Obviously, it's a huge deal, right? Never happened before. It's a huge example of checks and balances here, right? There's a president performing high crimes to lose his presidency. That's a very big deal, right? And so that ticket in the bottom right, people came and watched this. It wasn't televised, obviously. Now, ultimately, he was not impeached, and the votes came down to the very, very kind of last votes here. But a couple, I want to say 6 or 7 Republicans actually voted against party lines and voted not guilty. And they essentially said, look, this guy is annoying and he's not a great fit and blah, blah, blah. But what he did was not an impeachable offense. It wasn't a high crime and misdemeanor. It was, bad temper and bad, it wasn't, bad fit here. Yeah, it was such a big deal. As this, we've had 3 impeachment processes now. So, all right, and then let's talk about another random thing for this time period. William Seward, Secretary of State, I think. Is that right? He decided that Alaska, this is the time. Russia basically was ready to give up. They didn't have the manpower, the desire to want Alaska anymore. Now, if you know location here, obviously this is Britain here, right? This is Russia right here, essentially. I mean, right here. I can see Russia from my backyard. Why in the world would America go after something that's not contingent? It's not, I mean, it's close, but, well, a lot of people made fun of him for that. They called it Seward's folly. Folly is like a childish act. Now look at this though. This is the size of Alaska. I don't think we recognize this. This is Alaska, and look how big it is. And so Seward kind of thought a couple things. Is one, it's going to help our relationship with Russia. And then, who knows about the resources that will be there. Fur had been there, and then eventually, now today, the gas and the oil and all just, stuff that's valuable now in our society. So, looking back at Reconstruction, right? What was it? Did it work? Was it beneficial? Did it work, I guess? And you really have to kind of think about what is the legacy of Reconstruction. Did it actually help blacks recover? Did it give them a step up in their lives? Did it punish the South enough? And the answer to those questions are no, both of them. Who knows what Lincoln would have done? Who knows what any other president would have done? Um, and it hasn't officially ended until we talk about something else that happened. But in a lot of ways, these freedmen were not helped and kept in oppression and kept subservient to these, landowners in the South. And because of that, I think this is a huge takeaway, okay? Because of leaving kind of them out to dry in a lot of ways, their recovery into society is going to, and think about this, blacks in the very beginning, really, the slavery process. And so, because of this, a lot of the civil rights movement were going to have to be necessary at some point because Reconstruction wasn't very powerful for them. So, all right. All right. See you guys. Hold on. There's my pause button. Bye.